Okay, can you hear me now? Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, yes.
Great. Okay. Thank you. Sorry for waiting. Okay, let's start. So let me share my screen. Are you seeing my screen? Yep. Okay. Okay. So we have 5 speakers this morning. The first one is Kevin Reiss. He's going to talk about the breakdown of the metastable state in the beta Fermi-Pasta-Ulam-Tsingou lattice. Kevin, are you ready?
Yes, I'm ready. Let me just figure out how to share my screen.
Yeah.
So unshare your screen.
Okay.
No, don't do that. Just go to the view option. Just go to the share screen and unshare. Stop sharing.
Okay. There you go.
Okay.
So you go to the middle button and yeah.
You see that? Are you able to see my presentation now?
Oh, I do.
Yes, we can see your presentation and we can hear you, Kevin.
Great. Just curious, are you able to see my mouse as well?
Yes, we are.
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. So hello, everyone. My name is Kevin Reiss. I'm a student here at Boston University in the Department of Physics. Today, I'm going to be talking to you about the destruction of Fermi-Pasta-Ulam-Tsingou recurrences. This is about some work that I've been doing with both Professor David Campbell and Salvatore. So first off, let me introduce you to the models that we'll be looking at. We are looking into both the alpha FPUT model and the beta FPUT model. Both of these models are slight permutations from n coupled masses who obey an attraction between them that is slightly perturbed from a normal linear Hooke's law, such that we add both a cubic potential in the alpha model or a quartic potential in the beta model, and we control the relative strength of this nonlinear term with the parameter either alpha in the alpha case or beta in the beta case. On both of these models, we consider a normal mode canonical transformation. And normally, if this were the linear and coupled masses, then this transformation would essentially decouple the masses, such that if we started the system with all the energy in one of these normal modes, then it would remain all in that normal mode, oscillating at the same frequency without spreading energy from mode to mode. However, due to this perturbation here, we now have the ability, well, the system has the ability, to share energy amongst normal modes. And the expectation, at least in the 1950s, was that these systems would rapidly thermalize. Each mode would get an equal share of energy across a time average, and that the equipartition theorem would be satisfied. But the big surprise that was noticed in the system is a near recurrence of the initial state. So this recurrence phenomenon is demonstrated by this graph here, which shows the time evolution of the normalized energy in a couple of the normal modes when all of the energy is started in the first normal mode. And we can see that as time goes on, most of the energy leaves that first normal mode, but eventually does almost identically come back at what we call the first recurrence time, which we call TR. This time scale is much shorter than the Poincare recurrence time, so we don't have to worry about this just being a trivial effect of an effect like the Poincare recurrence time. And this behavior, whereby the energy is starting to return to the first normal mode, to the initial condition of the system on a very almost periodic time scale, this stalls the system's ability to approach equilibrium. Now, one of the first things that we noticed if we were looking at the beta model was that when we had beta being positive, meaning that the interactions were attracting between masses, we saw that a lot of the energy, so these blue lines here represent the energy in the first normal mode against time again. And we see that the energy gets shared mostly into the third, fifth normal modes, and the energy almost identically leaves the first normal mode before coming back at the recurrence time. Whereas if we look at the Hamiltonian for the beta model case with beta being negative, almost all the energy is staying in this first normal mode. So there's much less so-called energy mixing going on, whereby our initial state is actually retaining a much higher identity as the time goes on through the system. Now, we wanted to quantify this by looking at different systems of different energies and different numbers of masses. And so we took this quantity that represented the minimum energy in the first normal mode on the time scale from time 0 to the first recurrence time. And we plotted this, this quantity on a sort of heat map here, whereby we can see that for beta being negative, all these systems, about 70% of the energy completely stays in the first normal mode, remaining identical to the 70% identical to the initial state of the system up to the recurrence time. Although for positive beta, we see that almost all the energy leaves. This minimum value is almost 0 for the time scale up to the first recurrence. So we're getting much higher levels of energy mixing in the positive beta case. Now, what we really intended to do was to determine the relative quality of recurrences between these different systems. And what this makes tricky then is actually being able to compare these, because initially the thought was, well, what if we just compare the energy that's present in the first normal mode at the recurrence time to the energy that was present initially, and that would tell us the strength. But due to this discrepancy in energy sharing, it becomes a little bit trickier. So that is why we introduced this quantity called shareable energy. But what we do here is we take the energy that's present in the first normal mode at a given time, and we subtract out the minimum energy that we calculated on the previous slide from that energy value, and that gives us what's called the shareable energy. This represents the energy that's present in the first normal mode at a given time that is able to leave the first normal mode up to the first recurrence time. Now, with this new quantity, we can compare the relative quality of recurrences. So first, we're going to look at the alpha model. And what we can see here is we've plotted this quantity that, as I said, represents the relative strength of a recurrence. So a lighter color is a stronger recurrence, and a darker color is a weaker one. And we take many different system sizes and number of masses, and many different values of this essential system parameter R, which it has been shown that the recurrence time in the alpha model is a function only of this parameter R for large enough values of n. And what we can see surprisingly here is that as we increase R, the recurrences start to die off at almost the same rate for every single system size n. So this so-called depth of the recurrences is not really a function of the system size. In fact, it is just like the recurrence time, nearly almost a function of that system parameter R. Now moving on and looking at the beta model, we expected that we would see a similar quality whereby the so-called death of these recurrences would happen at values of the parameter S, which again, it has been shown that the recurrence time in the beta model is a function only of this parameter S. Surprisingly, when we started to do the simulations and we take the same quantity over here that represents the shareable energy, or the so-called strength of these recurrences. And we can plot this again for many different system sizes. And we see that surprisingly, the death of these recurrences happens at constant values of this energy times beta parameter, not at not as a function of, or not at a constant value of this parameter s. So this actually doesn't come into play when considering the death of recurrences. In fact, it's merely a constant value of energy whereby the recurrences stop forming, where we get these dark purples that represent almost no recurrence. And even more surprisingly is that the value of energy where these recurrences stop forming in the positive beta model is actually less than the value where the recurrences stop forming in the negative beta model. So we're able to go to higher energy levels in the negative beta model, which, remember, has an unstable potential. And we can get recurrences that are stronger even at these higher levels of energy. So some conclusions, some big takeaways. First off, the beta model, as I pointed out, has a very different level of energy sharing when you consider the negative beta case versus the positive beta case, and also comparing it to the alpha model. The recurrences in the alpha model depended only on the system parameter R that has been noted in the literature for other important qualities of the system. Meanwhile, the recurrences in the beta model are a function of this just energy, and are again independent of n, but are not a function of the system parameter s in that model. Next steps that we're taking, we're looking into implications of these results for the so-called metastable state. So when these recurrences are forming, this pushes the system into a metastable state where, as I had mentioned, it's almost stalled its approach to equilibrium. It's not able to fully thermalize yet. And so we're looking into the implication of what role these recurrences play in that metastable state, and also looking into why do we see this significantly higher value of energy sharing when beta is positive as opposed to when beta is negative. And with that, I'll ask if there are any questions.
Okay, thank you. Great.
Thank you.
Anyone want to ask questions?
I'd like to ask a question. Actually, why can't I see the screen here?
Well, we can see you.
Right, you can see me. Yeah, it's a nice talk, Kevin. I had a question. So the metastable state, or whatever you want to call this thing, do you have any idea how long it takes for the system to exit that state, or what is the probability distributions at exit times?
Yeah, so that's a very good question, and that does play into a bit of a future direction that we're looking with this. So people have looked into the time it takes for these systems to thermalize and to reach equipartition, but the metastable state will, of course, have to break down before that happens. And so what we are interested in, don't have complete results yet, but are looking into is how long does it take for this metastable state to break down for different systems with different system sizes and different energies, and in particular the role that the formation of these recurrences plays in that breakdown. Does that answer?
Right. Yes, it does. I mean, usually you would think of the breakdown as the time scale as varying with the system size
Right.
to some power, like to the d-1/d or something like this. And in one dimension, of course, you don't really have nucleation or anything like that. So I wondered what would be the controlling parameter, but I understand that you're still looking into that.
Yeah, exactly. And it would be again to see if maybe it does follow those essential system parameters that I mentioned for the beta and alpha model, or if it's some other new parameter. The equipartition time seems to depend only on the energy density, the energy divided by the system size, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the metastable state breaks down at the same time.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Any other questions? Okay.
Ask Kevin.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so our next speaker is Salvatore Pace. Kevin? Oh, yeah, thank you.
Great.
Okay, so I'm going to try to share my screen here.
You. It's the button at the middle button in the panel. What happened there?
Okay, so I'm trying that now. Oh, I may have to, so I have some privacy issue where I have to restart Zoom. So I'm going to restart Zoom so I can share the screen, and then I'll re-enter this conversation.
Okay.
Something weird in the way you set it up. I don't know what it is. If we don't have the video set up, then it goes to that kind of blank screen.
It's recording.
Yeah, that's it. If I turn it off, it does that. I don't know why. But it's some setting you have.
Okay, so I'm back. And I share.
Yeah, great.
Okay, wonderful. So can everyone see my screen and hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. Well, hey, thank you for throwing this virtual March meeting together for our session. I'm Sal. I'm from Boston University. I also work with Kevin and David Campbell as well. And today I want to talk about the scaling of the Fermi-Pasta-Ulam-Tsingou recurrences that Kevin just introduced to us, particularly only in the beta model. So I have the benefit of going after Kevin, who just did a terrific job at introducing the phenomenon, but let me quickly review it. So in 1955, these four nice scientists looked into a fundamental problem of, what is the validity of the ergodic hypothesis? If I have a dynamical system starting far from equilibrium, will it approach an equilibrium state, which is described by energy equipartition? And they started with the simplest model they could think of, which is just, let me take a harmonic oscillator and perturb it very weakly. And so in the Hamiltonian we're studying, which is called the beta FPUT chain, it is just a harmonic chain perturbed with this quartic term, and the strength of the quartic term is given by a parameter beta. So as Kevin already described, the expectation was that the system would thermalize quite quickly and energy would be shared equally among the linear normal modes. However, for long wavelength and low energy initial conditions, what they found was very different. So here I show a plot of the energy in each normal mode as a function of T divided by TR, where TR will be defined as the recurrence time. And we see that initially the energy starts being shared into these other normal modes. However, quite quickly, you see that the energy returns. And exactly at T equals TR, you have what we're calling the FPUT recurrence. It's a near return to the initial state. So what I want to discuss in my talk is how does this time at which the recurrence occurs depends on the system's size and the system's energy and this parameter beta. So the results I'll be sharing with you is that one, we found that there's a rescaled recurrence time, which I'm going to call big T, and big T is equal to little t, the actual time, divided by n plus 1 cubed, where n is the system size. And we find that for large n, this rescaled recurrence time depends only on a parameter we define as s, which is equal to e times beta times n plus 1. What else I will share with you is that the recurrence time differs between the positive and negative beta case. And this is unlike for the alpha model, which has a cubic interaction. The sign of alpha doesn't play a role in the dynamics. but the sign of beta we find plays a non-trivial role in the dynamical consequences of these recurrences. And then finally, we're going to look at two different regimes. One is a small absolute value of S regime, and one is a large absolute value of S regime. We find that in the small absolute value of S regime, the recurrence time can be understood using a perturbative method that's been previously developed. And that for the large absolute S regime, we show that the recurrences can be understood in terms of solitons, similar to how recurrences in the alpha FPUT chain can be understood in terms of solitons. So let's start with the small S regime, or actually, sorry. First, let me just show some of the numerical data. So like I said, we'll define big T as this little t divided by the system size cubed, and S is equal to E times beta n plus 1. And the numerical results are as follows. So on the left-hand side, I'm showing beta being greater than 0. On the right-hand side, I'm showing beta being less than 0. And this is a rescaled recurrence time as a function of S. So we find that for S being small in both cases, we can fit the rescaled recurrence time to a linear function. So these different colors in these plots correspond to different system sizes. And this fit right here, if you follow my mouse, is going to be this linear fit, and the fitting coefficients are approximately the same between the two different regimes. Now, as we start to increase S, you'll note that the data points start to stop. So for example, this n equals 63 data point ceases to exist past this turn critical S in both cases. And this is just a result of the system actually no longer having recurrences, or in the negative beta case, the system becoming unstable and no longer having recurrences. However, note that, just because you don't see an n equals 511 for small s, there's still one there, but the data points just are exactly on top of each other. So now if we go to large S, we find that in both cases, it exhibits a power law scaling, this rescaled recurrence time. And this power law, the exponent is both -1/2. What's interesting is that the coefficient is different between the two cases. So for negative beta, it's about 0.3, and for positive beta, it's about 0.59. So now if we go to this small S regime and we approach using some analytics, what we can do is we can use a result that's already in the literature that was found by Scholl and Henry, and that's the recurrence time, little t, should be equal to some sort of 2 pi over this difference in these, what they define as nonlinear frequencies. Now, these nonlinear frequencies, if you want to know more, I have backup slides, but they're just the normal linear frequencies perturbatively corrected as a beta, then there's a beta squared term and a beta cube term. So what we did is we took this expression and we extended their perturbation theory and found that we were able to write the rescaled recurrence time as a function of only the previously described S, with correcting terms that die off like 1/n². So if we look at this complex term and compare it with the numerical data, we find that there is excellent agreement for an S going from -10 to say S equaling about 5. So this also includes the linear transition between negative beta and positive beta as well. Now, if we went to higher order in this perturbation theory, we expect that the fit would also do better for larger values of S. So for the large S regime, what we can look at is we can say, well, large S should mean large system size. So we should expect that we can understand the recurrences by understanding the continuum dynamics. And it's well known that in the continuum limit of the beta FPUT chain, the dynamics are described by what's called the modified Korteweg-de Vries equation. And it's given right here. There's some field phi, and this little b parameter is the sign of beta. And this zeta parameter goes like 1 over the absolute value of beta. Now, we numerically solve this modified Korteweg-de Vries equation using initial conditions that exactly match the initial conditions we have on the lattice. And we find that, like in the alpha FPUT case, these solitons also form. And that on these plots here, which are heat maps with the system size on the horizontal axis and the time divided by the recurrence time, this T sub R being the recurrence time found with the numerical simulations on the lattice, that at T equals T over R for both positive and negative beta, the solitons exactly overlap, causing this recurrence to the initial state. So we can actually show some nice pretty pictures. So first starting with beta being positive, on the left shows the heat map, and on the right is going to show a little movie when I play it of how these solitons emerge from this cosine background, which mimics the initial conditions on the lattice. So let's play that. So we could quickly see these solitons form, and note that exactly we'll soon see this big overlap between solitons here, right there. And that's exactly what happens on the left-hand side in the heat map when these two solitons overlap. So we'll soon see that the solitons start to overlap with each other, and we get back to this initial cosine we had. That's now this not as perfect, which resembles the fact that it's not a perfect return to the initial state. So if we go to negative beta and do the same game, there's an interesting difference that occurs with the solitons. So before you saw the solitons form on top of the background. So there were positive solitons in the positive background and dark solitons in the negative background. What you see here is the opposite for the negative beta case. So the solitons form, but they always form inwards. So you have bright solitons in the background, which is more negative, and you have dark solitons in the background, which is positive. And once again, exactly as at the time predicted on the lattice, you see that the solitons all overlap, and you have approximate return to the initial state. So this difference between the solitons forming as bright solitons on the dark background or bright solitons on the bright background is actually able to explain this difference of a factor of about 2 we saw in the numerics. And we speculate that the cause of this difference can be explained by, for the negative beta case, for the MKDV equation, the modified Korteweg-de Vries equation, there are kink and anti-kink solutions. And it appears, this has not been rigorously proven, but it appears with the numerics that the background that forms for the negative beta case is a kink background. And the way that solitons interact with kinks in the MKDV equation gives rise to the difference between how the solitons behave for positive and negative beta. So we can use the MKDV equation and go to this regime as done by Toda previously in the alpha model that let's approximate the soliton dynamics as non-interacting. And if you have non-interacting solitons and you can find their velocities, then you can find the time at which they'll all overlap with each other. And we've done this, and you see that with the 2 expressions shown for both positive and negative beta, for large S, we recover this 1 over square root S scaling. And we can compare these 2 expressions shown to the numerics. And for negative beta, we see it matches a little better than positive beta, but it does indeed describe this power law scaling, and it does indeed show the difference in the coefficients being about a factor of 2. So let me just recap what I just told you. So we looked at the FPUT recurrences and how they scale in the beta FPUT lattice. We found that for large N, the recurrence time, this rescaled recurrence time, only depends on this parameter we defined as S. There's a non-trivial difference between the positive and negative beta case. For small s, we were able to analyze the recurrence time and find an expression using a perturbation theory, which was previously developed by Henry and Scholl, but we extended their results. And finally, for large S, we showed that similar to the story in the alpha model, the beta model, there's this continuum with the MKDV solitons, and that the difference in the recurrence time between the negative and the beta FPUT models can be understood by how these solitons interact with the backgrounds formed in the continuum. So thank you very much for listening, and let me thank my 2 collaborators on the project, and I'll be happy to take any questions anyone may have. Thank you.
Thank you. Great. Thank you very much. Any questions? So, do you want to ask a question? Should I?
You ask.
Yeah, it's on, right?
Yeah.
So may I ask that how does noise play a role here? Like, do you have some intuition that how noise can affect the recurrence time in different regions, like the positive or negative beta value?
Sorry, I don't know if I understood your question. Could you repeat it, please?
My question simple is that if you add a noise in this system, then how would it affect the results? That
At a node, did you say?
add a noise.
Oh, noise. Ah, I see.
Yeah.
You know, that's a wonderful question, and there was recently some work done by Porter on that exact question, and it was found that the recurrences are very fragile to adding noise. So this project this paper's in PRE. It was published last year, and they found that adding noises in the masses on each lattice site, or even the couplings between the different lattice sites, quickly destroyed the recurrences. So I would anticipate that if noise was added, given enough noise, which wouldn't be that much, you would see a lot of these results no longer hold.
I see. Did you say the noise will make a recurrence occur faster?
No, it would diminish the quality of the recurrences, and enough noise very quickly would cause the recurrences to no longer form.
I see. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll stop sharing my screen.
Okay.
Pause share.
Great. Okay. Okay, I'm the next. Should I just use my microphone? Okay, my name is Shih. I'm from Academia Silicon University of Illinois at Japan. And I'm going to talk about collaborative work done with Gregoire Lemont, Muken Masteven, Jose Lopez, Catalinga, Bjornhoff, Joachim Mathisen, and Nigel Gonafel. And okay, let me start. So there's been great advance in the field of transitional turbulence in the last decade. And for example, when we look at the pipe flow and we crank up the pipe flow at the intermediate Reynolds number and create some turbulence in the systems, like in this snapshot. So this turbulent region is called a puff and it's metastable. Meaning that, so you can imagine when you zoom in this turbulent puff and look at its dynamics, and it's stochastic. So you can imagine that the turbulent density at each coarse-grained patch inside this puff can spontaneously decay at an intermediate Reynolds number, or it can also contaminate its neighbor. So this behavior is just like a directed percolation. And it has been shown in this paper, Sipos and Goldenfeld, that a simple direct percolation model can capture the transitional behavior in the pipe flow experiment. And also the experiments, those experiments was done by Bjornhoff's group, published in Hoff et al. And Abler et al. They show that near transition regime, the mean lifetime of a single turbulent puff follows a robust super exponential scaling, and it's quite remarkable. On the other hand, when you look at a Taylor-coordinate flow, the transitional behavior is quite different. This is an experiment done by Bjornhoff as well, and it was published in the Lemont et al. A few years ago. So what they did is they create a spatial setup for Taylor-coordinate flow and create many turbulent puffs in the system. So the interesting thing is that when you have this multiple turbulent puffs in the systems in the Taylor-coordinate flow, and the trajectories of those puffs in space and time, like I'm showing here, they show the direct percolation patterns. So what I mean by that is that when the Reynolds number is below the critical point, the trajectories of those puffs in space and time will decay within finite time. However, above the critical point, you have these turbulent fractions survive at the infinite time. And near the critical region, then you can measure the fraction of these turbulent trajectories as a function of Reynolds number. And they found there's a parallel scaling with exponent in the direct percolation universality class. And those exponents only depends on the dimension. So when you look at and compare this to two systems, one is in pipe flow with only single puff, and you can see direct percolation dynamics inside the puff. But in lattice chaotic flow, we have the many turbulent puffs, and it shows globally there's direct percolation pattern with parallel scaling, like a phase transition you would expect it. So naturally, the question is that how general is the description of direct percolation in transitional turbulent systems? For example, if we have pipe flow with many turbulent puffs, like in telecoic for the case, can we still observe this global spatial temporal pattern like direct percolation and the critical scaling? And this question was studied by Bjorn Hoff's group. They did a pipe flow experiments and with many turbulent puffs. And they found below the critical point, the trajectories of the turbulent puffs in space and time would show this decaying phase. And this is what you would expect. However, if you increase the Reynolds number, and there are many turbulent puffs, when the two turbulent puffs are close to each other, so there'll be interaction between them, meaning that when you look at space and time configuration, you will see the downstream puffs will be pushed away. So there's some repulsive force between them. So you would imagine when the Reynolds number increase above the critical point, then the space-time trajectories would lead to a crystallized phase like in this plot. So the turbulent puffs will be separated with some distances. And this is not what you would see in the normal direct percolation. And when they measure the turbulent fraction scaling near the critical point, the scaling also deviates from direct percolation. So now the question is that, so in general, how transitional pipe flow is, and is not like direct percolation at all. So to understand what's happening, we study a very simple lattice model for the interacting turbulent puff in the pipe flow. So the idea is we modify the totally asymmetric simple exclusion process model or test set. In this model, you have a 1D lattice with an inflow and outflow of particles which are hopping randomly on lattice. And the idea is that this 1D lattice is just like a pipe flow, and the particle is like a turbulent puff. So we include the random propagation, the decay and splitting, like in test model, but we also include the interactions between the turbulent puffs, like splitting and pushing, meaning that when the two puffs are close to each other, the right side one will be suppressed or pushed with some rates. Then we can write down the reactions for each event and derive the mean field equation and stochastic hydrodynamics equation. So what we find is that the resultant equation is kind of like direct percolation, but it's different. So we got this additional nonlinear terms coming from the suppression, the pushing interaction terms. So now the question is how those terms would affect the direct percolation behavior. So our idea is to adopt the concept in phase transition by using a renormalization group analysis and study it around the direct percolation fixed point. So what you do is you first write down the action for the direct percolation like this, and then we do the dimensional analysis to compute the dimension of each term. And we read off the least divergent term, in this case is U3. And then we compare it with the puff interacting model and look at the general form of each term in the model we write in the previous slide. So the general form is like this, and we can compute the dimension of the coefficient. And the idea is that when we compare this dimension with the least divergent term during population U3, then if this term is scales less than U3, then this term is irrelevant. And so it turns out the old terms in the puff interacting models would become irrelevant at the during population critical point. So the conclusion is that the transitional pipe turbulence with interacting puffs should still be in the universality class of directed population. We tested this by doing the stochastic simulations. So this is our simulation result as a function of a puff splitting rate. And we measure spatial temporal pattern as a function of this rate. And we observe the similar behavior like experiment, meaning that below the critical point, we see this decaying phase. And when you zoom in, you can see the trajectories are decaying. And above the critical point, we observe this crystallized phase. And this is what you observe in experiment. And around the critical point, we can measure the fraction, the turbulent fraction as a function of the control parameter. And we are able to measure the power law scaling with the direct population exponent. And this is good, but the problem is that you don't observe this critical scaling in the experiment. So what's going on? Why is this critical scaling is missing in experiment? Our conjecture is that in experiment, there's a series finite size effect. So here I'm showing you a cartoon picture of the order parameter, which is turbulent fraction, and as a function of the control parameter. So the black solid line is the ideal continuous phase transition curve. And in the simulation, if a system is finite, or in experiment, if a system size is finite, the nearer the critical point, we know the correlation length will exceed the system size. So the strongly correlated fluctuations will make all trajectories decay suddenly together. So what it means that the transition point will occur above the ideal critical point. So you will see this sudden jump. Then the scaling exponent will deviate from the ideal exponent. On the other hand, if the system has a short runtime, then the trajectories would still survive even though they should die in the infinite time. So what you will see is that you see this rounding effect in this curve, and the transition point will be below the ideal critical point. So when you measure scaling exponent, it will also deviate from the ideal curve. So when we increase the simulation time and system size in our stochastic simulations, we are able to recover the ideal continuous phase transition curve. And we can also quantify how serious the finite size effect by writing down this quantity Q as in terms of the ratio of a runtime T and the system size L. So if this quantity is too small, that means the runtime is too short, then the critical point will be underestimated. And when you measure the critical behavior, you will find a larger scaling exponent, and vice versa. And similarly, if there's a strong interaction in the systems, like when the two turbulent puffs are close in a pipe flow, then this the interactions between the turbulent puff will confine the turbulence puff, so it will behave like a finite system size effect. So we can write down a similar quantity to describe that effect. We also study a continuous model which focuses on the interacting force between the particles. So in this model, the particles are ordered on a continuous 1D space, and we study the equations of motion of the particles' position, and then which is controlled by the velocity field, and we also add additive white noise. And this velocity field is a function of the particle distance, and it can be read off from the experimental data. We write down how the decay rate, the splitting rate, and effective Reynolds number as a function of this function, and we did stochastic simulations of this model. And we found that we can recover the same spatial temporal phase diagram like an experiment. Here's a decaying phase and the crystallized phase. And then near the critical, about the critical point, and we can measure the turbulent fraction as a function of Reynolds number, and we found this power law scaling with the Dirk percolation exponent. However, the result kind of depend on the parameter values. For example, if the additive noise in our model is too large, and we observe some artifacts similar like the finite time effect, and we're still studying this problem. So to conclude, I've shown you there are two aspects of Dirk percolation in the transitional Shih flow. The one is that if there is only one turbulent path, then there's Dirk percolation dynamics inside the path. Or you can regard one turbulent path as a Dirk percolation site, and globally you will see Dirk percolation behavior. And also, if there are two turbulent, if there are many turbulent paths, then there will be strong interactions between them. Then it will lead to crystallized phase. However, our analytical calculations and stochastic simulations show that these interactions between paths will only give you a finite size effect. So the conclusion is that this system is still captured by direct percolation, and it is still in direct percolation universality class. And we have our related projects going on, which is in the talk by Nigel Gonfell, and it was also recorded, and you can find it online. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions, and thank you. Any questions? Okay.
Any questions from people?
Okay, no sharing, I just stopped sharing.
Yeah.
Okay, so our next speaker is supposed to be Jennifer, but she's not here. Okay.
So then I suggest go on to the next one.
So, okay, then let's go to the next speaker, Yian. Are you there?
Hi, everyone hear me?
Yeah. Please share your screen.
Can you see my
Yes, we can see your screen.
and can you see my mouse as well?
Oh, yeah, we can.
Okay. All right. Good morning, everyone. I'm Anne. I'm an undergraduate student working with Dr. Oren Schindel from Trinity University. And today I'll talk about the universality in kinetic models of circadian rhythms. To adapt to the 24-hour cycle on Earth, plants as well as other organisms have developed this system of chemical reactions to regulate the daily periodicity activities in the organisms. And we choose to study the plant Arabidopsis thaliana to see the underlying property of the circadian rhythm networks. This model has been widely studied, and in the past 15 years, there are 11 distinct models that biologists developed to describe the circadian rhythm networks. And here's a brief overview. This is the earliest model developed in 2005. There are 2 gene groups, and the red bar here means prohibition, and the black arrow means promotion or production. And this is the mathematical description of the model. Although there are only 2 genes, each gene have 1 mRNA and 2 proteins associated to it. And there's another protein that is light sensitive, which end up in 7 differential equations to describe 7 chemical species. These two genes also form a negative feedback loop on the right side. So when the LHY gene increase, it's going to prohibit the production of TOC1, but when there's a decrease in number of TOC1 gene, it's going to slow down the production of LHY again. And in this model, there are 29 free parameters in the modeling process. And later, people also discovered there are two arms of the system. One is the morning arm, including the PRR gene and the LHY gene, and the evening arm on the other side. And recently, this early flowering gene group is also discovered to be important to the model. When we look at the number of parameters here, we can see there's a parameter explosion problem in the modeling process. Therefore, our lab decided to take a different approach. Many of these models shows a hop bifurcation in the parameter space. Therefore, we utilize the fact and do the analysis accordingly. This is the earliest model. Again, there are 7 differential equations describing 7 different species, and all of them have this degradation term at the end, and M's are the degradation rate. When the degradation rate is large, the chemicals will leave the system too fast, which means there will not be enough chemical left in the system to do the chemical reaction, so the circadian rhythm might be terminated. And so we choose this M1, which is the degradation rate of one of the mRNAs, as our bifurcation parameter. And also to discover the underlying property of the models, we decided to do all the simulation on the light cycle. So the theta light term will be 1. Here are 2 signals from the 2005 model. On the left side, when M1 is small, we can see the system shows a sustained oscillation behavior of roughly 24-hour period. So the system is in the supercritical region here. But when M1 is large, the system shows a damped oscillation, and eventually the periodicity of the system get lost, which is just as expected. We're particularly interested in the supercritical region, and there are 2 values we want to measure from the signal. One is the frequency, which we calculated from the measured period of the signal. The other one is the amplitude of oscillation. These are the bifurcation diagram obtained from both the original model through ODE solver and from our theory. The theory curve in yellow are calculated through reductive perturbation method, which I'll introduce in a minute, and the blue dots are from ODE simulations. As we can see, the amplitude roughly follows square root of the parameter value, while the frequency is roughly linear, especially near the critical region. Here, we also redefine the bifurcation parameter to be critical value minus the original parameter divided by the critical value, so that the bifurcation occur right at mu equal to 0, and the positive mu value corresponding to the supercritical region. All the nonlinear system can be written in this vector form, where x are my variables and f are functions in terms of all the variables and the bifurcation parameter mu. When there's a hop bifurcation, we expect the solution to be in the form of fixed value x0 plus square root of mu times this function, which is related to the eigenvalue and eigenvector calculated from the linearized system at criticality, and this complex amplitude W. W is governed by the Stewart-Landau equation, which is shown here. G and lambda are parameters we could calculate it from the kinetic parameters of the model. And from the Stewart-Landau equation, we see that this complex amplitude must have the form of r e to the I theta, where r is a real valued amplitude and theta is the phase. And when we put the form of W back into the Stewart-Landau equation, we'll be able to obtain 2 equations, one for dr dt, the other one for d theta dt. And when we do that, we also find out that at long time limit, the frequency and amplitude tend to be a constant, which can be calculated using these values we calculated earlier from the model. And when there's a constant frequency and amplitude, we are able to find limit cycle in the parameter space, which is governed by this following equation. The U tildes are normalized eigenvectors, and here we see the amplitude is directly proportional to square root of mu, and the frequency is proportional to mu. So if you recall, we measured the amplitude and frequency from the signal earlier. Here we want to rescale them in such a way so that we could compare all the different models with the same scale, as well as directly to square root of mu and mu. So here are the results that we obtained from all the models. The yellow curve are square root of mu and mu from the theory side. And all these dots are within 10% error from the theory curve. As we can see, interestingly, although these models are obtained separately from each other, they all possess this Hopf bifurcation property in the parameter space, especially near the critical region. The perturbation method actually predict the behavior of the dynamical system quite well. To recap, we run the simulation for all existing models of circadian rhythm in Arabidopsis thaliana under light condition to see the underlying property of the model. And in the previous modeling process, what people usually do is searching through the parameter space and run the simulation using an ODE solver, matching the signal with experimental data, and then find the best fit values for the parameters. But there are two potential problems. One is that this method is computationally heavy, especially for the large models that have like over 100 parameters. Secondly, because we're only comparing the signal to several days of time span, so the long time behavior of the system might be lost. That's why among the 10 models that we simulated, some of them are in the supercritical region, while the other ones are subcritical, which cannot be the case because there are just different systems describing the exact same physical system. So our lab decided to utilize the fact that these models all have Hopf bifurcation in the parameter space, and we performed the reductive perturbation method to them. And our method would turn the searching and finding parameter process into a much easier linear algebra problem. The two plots here shows the comparison of time series from our theory and the ODE solver. As we can see here, although the phase is slightly off, but our theory are able to predict the behavior, the dynamical behavior of the system quite well. In 2017, a group from Japan discovered that when the environmental temperature change, the circadian rhythm in cyanobacteria shows a bifurcation, a Hopf bifurcation in its gene network as well. And cyanobacteria is one of the earliest living organisms on Earth. And from our research, we discovered that the Hopf bifurcation also show up in higher organisms. And this makes us wonder that if this Hopf bifurcation property can be generalized to many other circadian rhythms, and if that's true, this will help us to understand living organisms on Earth and how they respond to the environmental a lot better and efficiently. Lastly, I want to acknowledge my advisors and colleagues, and if you have any questions, I will be happy to take them now.
Thank you, great. Any question?
I've got a question. That was a really interesting talk. My question is this, two questions really. So one is, do the physical systems, the actual biological systems, are they tuned to sit near the bifurcation point?
Yeah, that's a great question. Actually, we see that the system is actually in the supercritical region, really close to bifurcation. And that is why we're particularly interested in the supercritical region, which is not far from the criticality.
Right, so because a priori, so you're using the fact that you take this huge dynamical system and reduce it using amplitude equations and stuff to a much simpler set of equations, and so that's why there's the universality. So that's great, but that wouldn't a priori necessarily work for any system parameters. There'd be ranges way far from the bifurcation, and it wouldn't work. But the fact is that the real systems have tuned themselves to be near the bifurcation point, by some fortuitous or maybe some real reason. And so this is actually useful for systems biology. Did I understand it right?
Yes, that's right. And we do plan to do some experimental work like in the following academic year and see, so like from the previous experiment that we read from paper, all the systems that people have studied are actually tuned near the bifurcation. So that's why we decided to use this model. So what you said is exactly correct.
And how about other systems and systems biology? You know, if one looks at glycolysis or I don't know other biochemical processes going on in a cell, is there evidence that they are also tuned to be near the bifurcation point?
To my knowledge, not many people have been looking at the actual bifurcation of the system, but I know the cyanobacteria in the plant that we're studying are near the region.
I mean, there's other speculations. You know, my colleague Bill Bielek has written a number of papers on arguing that the brain is near a critical state or something like this, and of course there's a long history of self-organized criticality, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this is the first time I've heard about it in the context of circadian rhythms. So this is super interesting.
Okay, I'll look into that too. Thank you.
Thanks. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to drop me a line.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So Jennifer is still not here. So I guess then this is the end of our session.
Is there anybody else who's on the talk? Who hasn't talked? Yes,
there's another one. Jennifer Pierce. She's supposed to talk about gender bias.
Okay.
Yeah, but she's not here.
And Google and Aaron, are they part of this session?
No. Okay. Okay, so
Thank you.
Okay, thank you everyone, and thank you for all speakers, and thanks everyone showing up in this virtual session. So okay, then yeah, thank you.
Okay. Bye bye.
Okay, thank you. Bye bye.